welcome to SMARTpod, the podcast from Smart Security Solutions. I'm Andrew Selden. I'm the editor of Smart Security Solutions, and today we're talking to Hendrik Bruin from Checkpoint. Now, Checkpoint recently released its African Perspectives on Cybersecurity report for 2025, and there are quite a few interesting topics in the report which we could focus on, and we're going to be talking about that in a second. One of the most pressing issues from my perspective is the gap that seems to exist between the digital or technical advances that are happening in African businesses and government and the cybersecurity advances or lack of advances that are also happening or not happening, which are leading to quite a few cyber attacks and what have you. So there's lots of work to be done for African organizations, government and private organizations, because the cyber criminals are also doing a lot of work and they're using a lot of new tech like AI to make themselves or make their attacks faster and more efficient. So we all have to change our approach to defenses to be able to deal with that kind of stuff. So, Hendrik, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
And before we get into the questions, can I just ask you to introduce yourself briefly and just say a couple of words about Checkpoint, what you guys do?
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Personally, I've spent the past 20 odd, actually almost 25 years of my life in cybersecurity. Started, as I suppose a lot of us in the cybersecurity industry do, by deploying things like firewalls over 25 years ago. And from there, my career sort of progressed into things like identity and access management, governance, risk and compliance. And then my real passion has always lied with penetration testing and ethical hacking. So that's really what I've spent my past 25 years doing. From a Checkpoint perspective, so Checkpoint has been in the industry for more than 30 years. We offer cybersecurity solutions to some of the world's largest organizations. And the solutions that we offer, I think we are best known for our firewalls. And sometimes, in terms of the firewalls, I think we are a victim of our own success because our firewalls are so popular that it almost overshadows the rest of our solutions. But now we offer comprehensive solutions that can assist organizations to cover security risks related to their perimeters, their cloud environments, their workspace environments, email, mobile, etc., and now even artificial intelligence, so security for AI. And also, on top of our solutions, we also have a lot of AI for security. So that's essentially myself and Checkpoint in a nutshell.
Cool, thank you. It seems from looking at the report and from the event where you launched it, it seems that Africa seems to be behind in cybersecurity. The report shows that African organizations face just over 3,000 attacks per week versus the global average of just under 2,000 attacks. And also interesting, 41% of the cyber attacks are ransomware related in Africa, whereas the global average is 32%. So why do you think Africa is sort of so popular in terms of cyber criminals?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors that play a role there, Andrew. The first one is, of course, a rapid digital adoption that we've seen over the last decade or so. So, traditionally, when I looked at organizational attack surfaces, what you would look at is something like the organization's internet domain that was associated with a handful of IP addresses that was publicly exposed through something like a perimeter firewall. And through the firewall, you would expose the services such as a handful of web applications, perhaps VPNs, things like that. So, understanding your attack surface was fairly easy, and it was easy to also understand the risks and the security associated with that attack surface. But what we have seen with this digital adoption is also the adoption of cloud, right? Software as a service applications. And each time we adopt those type of technologies, we are also expanding our attack surfaces. So another example of that would be our brands and our logos. Our digital identity has also become an intricate part of our organizational security, because it's those brands and logos that attackers would often use for phishing attacks. And then also, our suppliers have also become part of that digital attack surface. So, if one of our suppliers were to get breached, a good example of this would be if a lot of organizations depend on third party solution providers, support providers, etc. If one of those support providers get breached, by extension, the organization can also get breached because already those organizations have access. So that is one aspect where we look at the digital adoption, which really increases the digital attack surface. Secondly, we also look at the fact that oftentimes we find that security is still a tick box exercise, right? So at some point, the auditor general or another auditor came in and said, you as an organization are required to have this specific defense in place. Then they would go out onto a procurement drive to procure that specific solution. But oftentimes, when they do that, they look at factors such as the price. They don't always look at the quality and the reliability associated with the solution that they are procuring.
Yeah, no, that always happens. Price rules the roost.
Exactly. But when you go out and you're looking at buying a new car, you don't only look at the price, right? You look at the price, yes, but you also look at the quality, the safety, and the reliability of that vehicle, because those are factors. But when we look at how certain organizations procure, they procure purely based on the price. So that is another aspect that we find, that oftentimes solutions are procured and it's not always the best quality. And then two other items that I want to mention is misconfigurations. Quite
Yeah.
oftentimes organizations have procured these solutions, they've deployed it, but it's not based on best practices. And that's why we still see organizations get breached regardless of the security solutions that they have deployed. So another aspect that I always like to mention, and specifically to bring it back to South Africa and the statistics we find around Africa, is I like to bring it back to the physical world. And I believe in the physical world, your best security for your home is looking less attractive than your neighbor, right? So having the higher walls, the higher fences, the bigger dog, or perhaps having the smaller TV is what you want. And that's why I believe Africa is being targeted so much, because we are looking more attractive from an attack perspective than our neighbors in other continents may.
Okay, okay. And it's actually interesting how many times it was mentioned in the launch event that misconfiguration is a major issue in cyber breaches.
Yeah, yeah. And we see that more and more, really. And as solutions, specifically, if you look at the cloud, cloud was promised to us to be more secure and simpler to configure and utilize. But what we found is, yes, to a certain extent, it is simpler. It's simpler to deploy new assets. It's simpler to deploy new servers and applications. But with that also comes more risks. And those addressing those risks are often a little bit more complex.
Right, right. You mentioned earlier the supply chain risks, if your supplier gets hacked or something. But in the reports specifically related to ransomware, they were saying that the ransom criminals have a three-pronged attack to extortion now. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, of course. So we refer to it as a triple extortion. And then I'll also mention something else that we see happening now. So, firstly, traditionally, what would have happened is when these ransomware gangs, and that's really what they are, I shouldn't actually even call them gangs, they are more like organizations now, with various role players and key individuals having specific tasks within the organizations. But in any case, be that as it may, traditionally, what would happen is they would get access to the infrastructure. From there, they would move laterally until they get to the sensitive data. And then what they would typically do is to encrypt that data. And then you would get some message informing you to pay them some amount of Bitcoin to get your data back. So that was the first stage extortion that we saw. Then what we started to see on top of that is that they now encrypted the data, and now they started going public because organizations started stopping, not paying the ransoms, etc. So to increase the pressure on the victims to really, pay for the ransom, they started taking them to the next step, and that's the second stage of extortion, where they threaten the organization to, either announce the breach publicly and go a step further by actually also announcing or publishing the data publicly, right? So that was the second stage extortion, asking you for money, or we will proceed by announcing this breach and publishing the data itself. And then this third stage now on top of that is where, if that is not successful, or sometimes even if it is successful, they would go to the third stage, which is actually reaching out to the customers that may be affected by this specific breach. So that might be the consumers themselves, or if this organization was a supplier, going back to the supply chain risks, if this organization was a supplier, then by extension, their customers could also be compromised depending on the data that the individuals, the ransomware organization or gang, got access to. So that's really how the triple extortion works. But now, the other trend that we start to see, and this happened, a case in point, I won't mention the organization itself, but one of the larger telcos in the country earlier this year got breached, and none of their data was even encrypted. It was simply a case of exfiltrating the data and then going to the second stage of extortion by saying that we will be publishing this data if you do not pay us a certain amount. So that's what we see now also, is exfiltration without encryption.
Okay, interesting. I suppose, yeah, that's even worse than having your data encrypted, is having them sort of broadcasted publicly.
Yes, and that's where the reputational risk really comes in, because organizations, as soon as this information becomes public, people get afraid to associate or perhaps conduct business with those entities. But that's something also that as society we should maybe consider to revisit, because the reality that we have nowadays is that organizations do get breached, and that we should not put pressure on organizations not to disclose when they get breached. I think we should rather have transparency, because through transparency, that's how we can identify the problems, bring it to the top of mind, and perhaps see if we can holistically, as society, assist in addressing these problems by creating societal awareness around cybersecurity.
Right, that's actually a good point. And in South Africa now, the information regulator forces you to declare if you've been breached.
Correct. But still, we find that, well, I personally believe that some of the penalties associated with it, especially when there's negligence involved, should be more severe. As I mentioned earlier, organizations do get breached. It is a reality of life nowadays. And perhaps if organizations did practice due care, due diligence, you can prove that they have done what was possible to them to avoid getting breached, then the penalty should not be as severe. But when we find cases where it was absolute negligence, then the penalty should be more severe. There was one instance of a credit bureau that got breached, and if I recall, it was because they had a relatively privileged account that was secured with the password of password. In that case, finding them R1 million is not adequate.
AI obviously also came into the report, and using AI on both sides of the coin. Can you tell us how the criminals are using AI and how the defenders can use AI to thwart the other AI?
Yeah, of course. Security for AI and AI for security, as they say. But what we have found, the biggest factor is that AI has now become a force multiplier. So we see the involvement of artificial intelligence in many areas. So first one, social engineering. So traditionally, it was fairly easy to spot phishing emails because they would have contained spelling errors, syntax errors, grammar was fairly poor, etc. So it was very quick to spot when some foreigner was trying to extort money from you. But that now has changed, because using generative AI, attackers and cyber criminals can very quickly generate very comprehensive lures that people are more susceptible to. So, and to an extent, they've almost automated the process, because they can now simply ask these generative AI solutions who are the key role players within an organization. structure an email. And then email even get things correct like the language. So if you're targeting a Portuguese organization, having the language changed to Portuguese and in that specific dialect, right? So that's the first area where we see the usage of AI. Then also in terms of content generation, we've seen AI being used to create TikTok videos. So earlier this year, we looked at a situation where a TikTok video spread that promised free access to a Spotify premium account if you follow the instructions within the video. And it looked very nice and very professionally created, etc. But when you follow the instructions, all you're really doing is actually downloading a piece of malware to your device that ended up stealing your credentials and your credit card information and multi-factor information, right? So that's the other area that we find. And then, of course, deep fakes. That's the big thing that we hear about everywhere. Creating audio deep fakes are fairly easy nowadays. Creating video deep fakes, it's not as simple. So if a family member phones you and it's got a video, it's most likely your family member, but maybe still worth a check. So that's where we see, in terms of social engineering, AI playing a role. Then, obviously, the creation of malware. So, one of the big things that we have seen in terms of generative AI is that people are using it for coding. They are using it as a coding assistant, augmented coding, all of those type of practices. And attackers are doing the same to create malware. So, you can now essentially create malware using natural language, where previously you would have had to understand coding, you would have had to be some type of a developer in order to create the malware itself. Another interesting thing that we saw in terms of malware was the usage of AI for evasion purposes, not invasion, evasion purposes. So the first interesting case we found was where we had found a malware strain that was actually attacking the AI detection engine itself. So, one of the key areas that cyber defense is using artificial intelligence for is for detecting malware and detecting threats in real time. So, what this individual or group of individuals attempted to do was to actually use malware and within the malware inside the malware itself, they hid a prompt injection attack to actually attack the AI detection mechanism itself. And then the
Wow.
other one that we also found was where they were actually leveraging AI to change the malware code on the fly. So one of the most simple ways of detecting malware is looking at the file signatures and comparing it to a known database of malicious file signatures, right? So just doing the signature detection. And by changing its code on a continuous basis, it's essentially changing that signature and thereby avoiding detection. So very interesting use cases of how attackers are using artificial intelligence. And then one other aspect is, of course, the information side. So utilizing bots to change or spread a narrative, to change a narrative that's currently out on social media, etc. And then there was a very interesting case in where a European university actually released a bunch of bots onto Reddit with the sole purpose of actually attempting to change the opinion of the individuals within the Reddit community. So fascinating stuff on how the attackers are using it. I'm assuming you also want to hear on how we are using it, right, from a defender
Yes, yes,
perspective.
please. We need it.
So, firstly, there's a lot of talk about what AI can do and what it can't do, and machine learning and all those type of things. But one thing we can all agree on is that machine learning and AI is very good at detecting patterns. And that's specifically what we are using to detect threats. So that's the first area where we are using machine learning and artificial intelligence is in the real-time detection of threats. And we're doing it to such an extent that we actually get like a 99.9% accuracy in terms of real-time threat detection. So that's one
Yeah.
aspect. Contextualization and correlation is another key aspect that we use AI for. So, if we look at a typical organizational environment, there's thousands of log entries being created every couple of minutes. And if you look at the entire security estate, we typically have over 100 different systems building these logs. And from a security perspective, it's important to analyze those logs and to see what is happening. But it becomes impossible to look at all those log entries, all the different logs from a human capacity perspective. So artificial intelligence and machine learning does a great job of actually correlating those events. So instead of a human having to analyze each one of those log entries to detect a threat, artificial intelligence can essentially contextualize and correlate it. So a security analyst has only one incident that they need to investigate and to remediate rather than looking at each of those individual log entries. So by doing that, we also address another key area that's of concern at the moment, and that's the skills shortages. So if we can simplify the management and the analysis of security, that means less reliance on human skills. Then from a complexity perspective, also in Checkpoint, most of our security solutions can now interact using natural language. So I can actually prompt my security estate about my security posture. So if there's a new vulnerability out there, something like tool shell that affected on-premise SharePoint servers a couple of months ago, I will be able to ask my AI copilot within Checkpoint, am I vulnerable to this specific vulnerability? It will actually analyze all the security policies and rules and determine whether I am vulnerable. And if it finds that I am vulnerable, not only can I prompt the security posture, I can also actually change it using natural language. So at that point, I can also instruct the Checkpoint estate to build policies to secure me, to secure my environment from that vulnerability being exploited. So that's the other area where AI really plays a role is providing us the ability to interact with security using natural language. And then, of course, the final aspect is automation. If we look at security orchestration, automation, and remediation solutions, this is where we can really do autonomous security. So through the ingestion and correlation and contextualization of all the log information, we can accurately identify when there is an existing threat within my organization. And then utilizing the automation part is where I can then automate the process of remediating that threat. So if it was malware on a device, isolate that or kill that process, isolate that device, scan the device for malware, and then also perhaps on your identity provider side, go as far as changing that account's password to make sure that we've really touched all the aspects, and we do that in an automated fashion.
Oh, okay. You touched on misconfigurations in the cloud earlier, but just to go there again, how would you suggest for cloud hosting services as well as edge devices, how would you suggest people go about protecting themselves and making themselves as secure as possible?
So great, yeah. From a cloud perspective, what we often find is organizations get breached because of the unknown. So firstly, they don't know in terms of the cloud environments what is exposed, how much it's exposed, and when it's exposed. Because of the dynamic nature of cloud, people are very quick to deploy new applications, to deploy new APIs, do security changes, etc. And that often opens up your avenues for attacks. So the first step that I would say is invest in something like a CNAPP solution, Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. So Checkpoint has a strategic partnership with an organization called Wiz. This is what they specialize in. So what your CNAPP solution will do for your cloud environment is to identify things like misconfigurations. It will identify vulnerabilities. It will be able to identify attack paths, exposed storage, cloud storage accounts, etc. And it will also assist you with remediative actions. So we personally, from a Checkpoint perspective, have an integration with Wiz, where if Wiz finds a vulnerability, it will alert the Checkpoint security infrastructure, and we can once again automate the process of deploying a protection in front of that vulnerability. So that is one key area that organizations should look at. And then also segmentation. So it's important for organizations to have an inspection point between the different data classification areas. So If we look at a cloud environment, most likely you have some sort of a web application that's exposed publicly, and it should be because it's a web application that your customers may interact with. But what you don't want is when a attacker gets access to that exposed web application, have the attacker move laterally to your sensitive information databases, etc. So what you want to do is to have an inspection point between the public facing assets and your more secure assets. So if your public facing asset gets compromised, the attacker still can't move from the public facing segment to the sensitive data segment. So that is something else that organizations should look at. And then also perhaps look at something like a continuous threat exposure management solution that will, on a continuous basis, uncover all of your exposed assets. Once we've uncovered all those assets, and this will be known and unknown assets, we will uncover all the risks associated with them, prioritize them, validate them, and also, once again, assist in the remediation. And by doing that, you are essentially remaining a step ahead of the attackers. So you will know about that vulnerability and that risk before the attacker has the opportunity to actually exploit it.
Okay, cool. Last question I have, which wasn't really in the report, but there was advice to take. But what would you suggest is a first step? An African organization might have their IT department and cybersecurity, but what's the first step they should take to assess their security posture and how ready they are for whatever may come in terms of cyber attacks?
So, yeah, for local organizations, firstly, they have to continue with regular things like penetration tests, vulnerability assessment, risk assessment. So, that they should do as often as possible, because that's how you also actively identify the risks and the vulnerabilities within your organization. Then, on top of that, leverage what you already have, right? So, part of that vulnerability assessment and penetration test, you will be able to detect weaknesses within your infrastructure. Address those weaknesses, right? So, if you have existing security controls that are not configured properly, and that's why the penetration tester got access, you need to address those vulnerabilities, address those risks, and address those misconfigurations. So, you've already invested in those tools. Make sure they are deployed appropriately based on best practices and harden them. And then also, on top of that, adopt strategies like zero trust. So, when I speak to the financial institutions, they often have a very mature cybersecurity posture. But then I go to some other institutions, and when I talk to them about zero trust, they've never heard of it. So, this is critical for organizations to educate themselves and adopt frameworks like zero trust, which is, once again, to a large extent, you can implement the fundamentals of zero trust by leveraging what you already have. It's a design and an architecture principle as much as it is a solution and a technology principle. And then, if money permits, invest in something like a continuous threat exposure management solution that will, on a continuous basis, in between the pen tests, the vulnerability assessments, understand, discover assets, find the vulnerabilities, remediate them, and keep your organization safe.
Cool. Okay, when it comes to zero trust, one of the things that always confuses me is continuous verification, which is supposed to be part of the zero trust architecture. How does that actually work? Because you can't ask me to enter my password every 5 minutes or do an MFA thing every 5 minutes.
Yeah. Firstly, is when we look at zero trust, there are some key principles that apply. Firstly, is your identity and your role in the organization determines what level of access you have, right? So that's the first part, is positively identifying yourself and positively being linked to a role. And then that determines what access, when, and how much access you have. Now, on top of that, we also need to do things like device posture checks to make sure that the device is patched to the latest version. It's running endpoint detection and response software, which is also up to date, etc. And then we can also look at things like impossible logins. So if we see that you are logging in from Johannesburg today at 10 o'clock, and now at 11 o'clock, you're logging in from China, that means something is fishy. So it's a combination of all those different factors that we actually use to do the continuous verification that there are now session hijacking or device hijackings, etc. So those are the mechanisms that we really use for that.
I think we're out of time, so thank you, Hendrik. I really appreciate it. A lot of info we got there. And as I said, I will include the download link and context and whatever with the podcast. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.
And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where AI takes cybersecurity in the future.
Well, yeah, on a final note, a couple of weeks ago, Anthropic found an attack targeting 30 different organizations, and it's estimated to have been between 80 to 90% automated. So human
Wow.
interaction, 10 to 20%.
Wow. Okay.
Crazy
That's
stuff.
scary. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew.